So it's great to be with you here today. Thank you for coming along. I am, of course, as Alex introduced, a geographer, and I'm going to talk about why I think we need to go beyond net zero carbon. Net zero carbon is seemingly everywhere. Everyone is talking about net zero at the minute, and it seems we're all in agreement that it's a good thing. What I want to do today is to encourage you to think a little bit critically about it and think about what else needs to happen to ultimately make the planet sustainable. So, who am I? I'm a lecturer in human geography. Broadly speaking, I am a political and environmental geographer, and I'm interested in the political, economic, and social challenges of realizing environmental change and realizing that post-carbon future that I think we're all striving for. Outside of my academic work, I'm also a member of the Manchester Zero Carbon Advisory Group, and that group works to advise Manchester on its climate change policies. So I'm involved in some of the policy side of things too. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, I want to, as I say, get you thinking critically about this idea of net zero. I'm going to start broad. I'm going to get us to think about the planetary scale because I think that's the most important place to start. Then I'll get you thinking critically about what net, neutral, and zero ultimately mean. I'm going to make the case that we need to think about the journey to zero carbon as much as the target itself. And then I'll move on to thinking about our relations with carbon, our relations with goods, and ultimately how cities have a role to play beyond their borders, as do nations too. And finally, I'll offer some thoughts to conclude. So that's the plan. And this is, of course, all against this backdrop of nations and cities aiming to go zero carbon. There is at least 110 countries that have now committed to going carbon neutral by the middle of the century. This includes the UK, but also countries such as Japan and South Korea. And cities are also playing a crucial part in this too. There is a group called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and some of the biggest cities in the world are part of this. Manchester's there, but also places such as Masdar, New York, Melbourne, Copenhagen. So there's a lot of interest in this idea of net zero and zero carbon. But let's, as I say, think first about that planetary scale. So we know that for the planet as a whole, there is a boundary between safer and more dangerous levels of warming. There is a point at which things get a little bit too dangerous for our liking. And historically, we have kind of thought of this boundary as being 2 degrees. And this has got roots in the work of an economist called William Nordhaus. So it wasn't a climate scientist that proposed 2 degrees as the boundary between safer and more dangerous levels of warming. He was an economist. And even William Nordhaus said that 2 degrees was purely a rough guess. He said it was deeply unsatisfactory. But yeah, it was enshrined in the Cancun Agreement of 2010 that we should try and keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees against pre-industrial levels. But as I'm sure many of you know, a little bit more recently, we've started talking about keeping temperature warming within 1.5 degrees. So in other words, the dangers of temperature increases have been revised upwards. And climate change has become tangible, right? We know it. We hear about the ice sheets shrinking. We see these wildfire events happening more frequently. Saddleworth Moor that I can see from my window, that was on fire the other year. We see photos like this of Venice underwater. We hear about small island states going underwater too. So we know that even going to 1.5 degrees of warming is now considered dangerous. And that's why the Paris Agreement commits us to trying to keep warming below this threshold. So that's the kind of planetary backdrop if you like, of what is happening and what kind of future we want for the planet. And you can see here 1.5 degrees of warming. We can expect heat waves of around a month each year. We know it's going to increase rainfall. It'll reduce crop productivity. So wheat production would fall below 10%. And sea level rise, we can expect something in the region of 40 centimeters. So it's pretty big in terms of the consequences of 1.5 degrees of warming, and 2 degrees is even worse. And I want you to think of this almost like a duvet, right? So every year we put more and more carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And it's like you lying in bed and someone chucking on duvets on top of you year on year. There's going to be a point at which you simply get too hot and you can't get rid of it. And that's exactly what carbon emissions do. So we need to think about the quantity of emissions that we emit year on year. It builds up in the atmosphere, and that's really crucial. And so if we think about this, if there's a total amount of carbon emissions that we can release before it gets too warm, then that's kind of a budget. And this idea of a budget is very similar to a monetary budget. So there is a total amount of carbon that we can release while staying within this threshold. And much like a monetary budget, we don't want to spend it all at once. So say if there's this amount of carbon to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, we don't want to blow the whole budget now. What we want to do is use it gently and gradually over the remainder of the century. So we want to be cautious and a little bit savvy with how we spend our carbon budget as a planet. So don't spend all of your carbon at once. And this means that we can think about these ideas of pathways. So how we spend the carbon over the coming years. And we know that it's hard to make emissions reductions. And what this graph shows here, it's a bit complex, but don't worry too much about it. Like, it shows the radical drop-off that we'd have to do if we were to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming. So that's asking an awful lot of us. We'd have to get to zero carbon as a planet really quite fast. You will have noticed that this graph actually moves. And what that's showing is, well, there's an idea that we can remove some carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and that would essentially buy us time. And that's what it's showing here. So that's what I want to talk about now. So this idea of net, neutral, or zero. So I'm going to introduce the differences between these key terms. So lots of cities are talking about zero carbon. And that essentially means that there is no carbon emissions being emitted. So this is absolute zero. Whereas when cities or nations are talking about carbon neutral or net zero, that implies a process of balancing. So this means that emissions are being offset somewhere else. So we're removing carbon at the same rate that we are emitting carbon. So net and neutral refer to balancing, whereas zero means that emissions are absolutely zero. So offsetting is the first way you can balance emissions, and that is where someone captures emissions from the atmosphere and simply removes them, or by someone giving up their share of the emissions so that you can release a little bit more. A fine example of this is a tree. We know trees take in carbon dioxide, so this removes, or to use the fancy word, sequesters carbon from the atmosphere and stores it in the tree. But as some of you might guess, there are some problems with this. It might seem all well and good doing it, but what if someone comes and chops the tree down? What if the tree dies? And so there's quite a few issues with offsetting in practice. Another way you could offset carbon emissions is by, as I said before, getting someone to change their practices or giving up their fair share of emissions. So this is one example where they would give people more efficient cook stoves in Honduras, and that would enable them to cook more efficiently and save some carbon. But again, there are issues with this. What if this person decides they don't like the cook stove that they've been given? Or ultimately, if the cook stove stops working, they might go back to using the inefficient one, and that might result in carbon emissions increasing. So there are definitely issues with offsetting. And also there's this idea that maybe you're paying someone else to do the dieting for us. What right do I have to say, go get on a plane and then ask that someone else plants a tree or uses a more efficient cook stove? So it's very privileged kind of activity. And also, it doesn't really incentivize behavior change. It encourages us to carry on as usual. So there are definitely issues with offsetting. Another idea that's now mentioned a lot is this idea of negative emissions technologies. So this is talking about engineering on a huge scale. So we're kind of getting these big fans, for instance, and sucking carbon out the atmosphere and then injecting it deep underground, deep beneath the rock, and locking it in there. So removing carbon from the atmosphere on a mass scale. So that example I gave you is called direct air carbon capture and storage. And it's really, really expensive. So it's currently around $150 per removing a ton of carbon. And the cook stoves example, by way of comparison, that would cost $8.50 a ton. So really, really expensive. And there are examples of negative emissions technologies, but these are largely unproven at scale. So I think the key point I want to make to you here is that if we proceed under the hope that offsetting and these negative emissions technologies will save us, that they will buy us more time in the future, that is a huge, huge gamble. And it's for that reason, I think we should be thinking about zero carbon, so absolute reduction in our emissions to zero, rather than net zero or carbon neutral, which is more about balancing our emissions through processes like these. So I now want to kind of segue into talking about the journey to going zero carbon. And lots of cities, lots of nations have got plans for when they're going to go zero carbon. So Copenhagen says that it wants to be the world's first carbon neutral capital by 2025. So this is really one of the forerunners. But there's this point that I want to make, that we should instead focus on the journey to zero carbon or net zero. And that's arguably more important. And of course, the United Nations have currently got this campaign where they're getting businesses, cities, regions, universities commit to the race to zero. And I think this is important, but I think it's also a little bit problematic in other ways too, because it puts emphasis on that end date when cities, nations, businesses become zero carbon. So here's the question: is it better to go zero carbon sooner? And I'll give you a quick example. This is Manchester's science-based pathway to go zero carbon. So this is what it's committed to in its climate change plan. So Manchester reckons that it's going to go zero carbon, or pretty much to zero carbon, by 2038. And it's committed to a pathway to getting there. So this is what it's hoping to achieve, the kind of line that it's hoping to take. But remember what I said to you earlier. It is the total amount of emissions that are released year on year. It's the amount of duvets that are piled on the bed that matters. And that's what we want to keep low, because that's the total amount of emissions in the atmosphere. But the point I want to raise to you is, imagine if Manchester did something like this, where its emissions stayed a little bit higher for longer, but then dropped off radically. Now, that in this example, that would be around 25 million tons of CO2, whereas the pathway that Manchester is committed to is around 15 million tons of CO2. So ultimately, what I'm saying here is that it doesn't always make sense to focus on the end date, because that doesn't dictate the amount of total emissions that a city or a nation is going to contribute to the atmosphere. And that's the important thing that we need to focus on. We should focus on what we're spending year on year. There's even an argument to say that we should hold back some of our share of the global carbon budget and hold on to it for a rainy day in case we need some more emissions in say, 2075. So I think it's really important to think about the journey and not just the destination. So exactly that point. And then finally, for the last part of my talk, ahead of concluding, I want to make the argument that we also need to think about how cities and nations, and indeed ourselves, relate to other places. And sometimes I sit and look at maps of cities, and I try and work out where they end and begin, and particularly where their reach ends and begins. And if I look at Manchester here, I don't really see an obvious end to the city. Rather, what I focus in on is the amount of roads and railways that span from the city into distant corners of the country. I can even see the airport on the map right down at the bottom. And what this highlights to me is how interconnected cities are, and really how much they're actually dependent on processes and things that happen outside of them. So I can see lots of farmland around Manchester, and I know that this is used for farming, maybe for milk, maybe for growing things, maybe for producing meat. And there's a whole host of carbon emissions that underpin these. Equally, I know if I look further to the other side of the world, I know there's factories producing iPhones and iPads there, and there's a whole host of emissions associated with them too, ahead of them being shipped in. So the city's reach actually goes quite a long way beyond its borders. And this is what this map shows. This is a shipping map from 2012. Of course, it might have looked a little bit different when the Suez Canal was blocked a couple of weeks ago, but the point still stands. There are flows of people, goods, money, and services that flow all around the Earth. Cities are connected and they have a global reach. And I think the point that I want to raise here is that cities could have many different carbon accountabilities. We can cut the global carbon cake in many different ways and say, this is Manchester's responsibility, this is China's responsibility, this is the UK's responsibility. But problematically, we tend to think of cities' responsibility in terms of their carbon accounts and their carbon budgets, and we tend to conflate the two. So I think the important point here is, what do cities really measure in their carbon budget? And the answer is that from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Guidance, cities and nations tend to measure emissions occurring within them and those from their electricity supply. And what climate change action plans target tends to follow suit. So they focus on cleaner fuels, they focus on building insulation, things like that. But there's a whole host of other things that can be targeted if we instead consider consumption, which isn't considered. So for instance, if I look around Manchester, I see new towers going up everywhere. And I know that glass and cement has tons of carbon emissions embedded into it. So much of the cement in Manchester is produced here in Hope Valley Cement Works in the Peak District. So these emissions might be released maybe out of this chimney, but they're not counted in Manchester's zero carbon budget. And I think this is a vital emission to think about. Equally, if I eat some strawberries that are maybe produced in Scotland and transported down to me, these are also not included in the city's budget. I mentioned iPhones earlier. I think you see the point. If they're produced overseas, they're not included in the zero carbon budget. What about flying? Manchester's got an airport. If I go and get on a plane, that's not included in Manchester's zero carbon budget. And what about waste? Most waste for the city of Manchester is disposed of in Bolton, over the border. So this again is not included in Manchester's carbon budget. So it's important to think about these carbon omissions too. And what I've been talking about here is what we might term as consumption-based emissions. And these are those emissions from goods and services that we consume, regardless of where they occur. And we know that by way of comparison to our production-based emissions, which is normally what we count, this is that yellow bit, they are quite large. It's around 50% as big again. Equally, this shows the scale of the footprint of Manchester Airport. So we need to think about these other things too. The other thing I'd flag to you is that when we're thinking about consumption, most of the world's emissions, half of the world's emissions, are actually released by the richest 10% of society. So the point I want to make to you here is that rather than just thinking about net zero, zero carbon, we should also tackle income inequality, because some of the poorer people at the bottom might benefit from some more emissions, whilst the top are the most polluting. And a final point I'd raise ahead of concluding is that we should also think about what cities and nations invest in, because this is another way that they can have an impact overseas or beyond their boundary. So really important to think about these multiple angles so that we can do all that we can. Or if you like, if we take the climate emergency seriously, we should pull multiple levers to reduce the planet's overall footprint. So to conclude, why go beyond net zero? Well, I've argued that net zero says little about what happens in the meantime. I've said that it gambles on technological innovation and risky offsetting practices to remove carbon from the atmosphere. I've also made the case that it ignores emissions from our consumption or our investment when we're talking about nations or cities. I've argued that we should focus on reducing emissions to absolute zero, that we should be specific about what zero carbon means, that we should move towards thinking about zero carbon holistically and relationally. What about our investments, our consumption, our travel practices? We need to think about those too and include them in our zero carbon budgets. I've said that we need to think more about the journey to zero carbon and not just the destination, and that we should address carbon inequality on our way. And I've argued that we shouldn't assume that we can fix things later by removing carbon from the atmosphere. This is too much of a gamble. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And if you want to get in touch, please feel free to drop me an email. And there are some references here that I've drawn on throughout the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.